Okay, well, I'm going to get started and then people might join late. Good afternoon. Welcome to climate change and our resources. And I'd like to welcome Barbara Clark from the Florida Public Archaeology Network. We really appreciate them partnering with us to do some of our online lifelong learning classes. A couple of quick announcements. First of all, we're not charging for these classes, but we have really lost all of our revenue from our, the classes that we are running. So if you can afford it and want to do it, we would really appreciate any online donations you could make to the Senior Center, because we're trying to keep as much as we can up and running. Our budget's really been cut a lot right now, so to the Senior Foundation, you can make donations online, and there's information there. So that's just my little commercial. And then also we have some upcoming classes. Barbara is doing another class for us next Thursday on historic cemeteries. Next Tuesday, I'm sorry, at 1:30, same time. And she's a real expert on cemeteries, and every time I hear her speak about them, I learn so much. It's really fascinating. So if you like what you heard today, come back next week. And then the following day, after her Tuesday cemetery class, her colleague Tristan Herenstein on Wednesday is going to do kind of a technology class on modeling historic headstones. And that should be really interesting if you have any interest in photography. I know when I visited some historic cemeteries, particularly I was in Boston last summer, and there were some really old headstones. They were really fascinating, and I wish I could do more with my photography of some of those really interesting ones. So if you're interested in learning about that, here's somebody else. Sign up for Tristan's class also. That's a really unique opportunity to have that. And then also I have an ongoing Geology of the National Parks class on Thursday mornings at 10. I know a lot of you are already in that, but people can still join at any time, and we're going to be putting up the recorded classes online soon. They're trying to get them edited. So I'm going to turn this over to Barbara now, and she's going to be the host. The rules, we just ask you to mute yourself while the speaker is talking, but if you have a question, you can jump in and unmute yourself and ask the question, and then just mute yourself again. Because when everybody's unmuted, we get the background noises from everybody's house. I know Barbara said she had to send her dogs to the dog sitter today so they wouldn't bark during the class. And my dog was just in here barking a few minutes ago. Luckily, she's not right now, but there's all kinds of noises from our homes, and so we want to keep that to a minimum. So unmute yourself if you have a question, otherwise keep yourself muted. And I'm going to make Barbara the host. That might take me a second, and then she will get started. And then Barbara, once I make you the host, if anybody else tries to join the class, you'll have to let them in, okay?
Okay.
All right, so here we go. Make host. Yes. All right, you're the host.
Well, before I share my screen, I just wanted to welcome you all and thank you so much for joining us. I know we're all, I don't know about you, but my schedule is completely gone. I have to wake up every morning and check my phone to see what day it is. So I hope you all are doing well and staying safe. With that, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try and keep tabs on the chat box as well. So if any of you have any questions and you're having issues with your audio, you can ask me questions that way. I'm a very informal speaker. It's very weird giving lectures over Zoom because I can't interact directly with you. I wish we were all in the same room, but I will try my best. So I apologize if it's a little awkward. Let's see here. Okay. All right, so can everybody see that?
I can.
Perfect, just wanted to double check. So today, as you heard from Maureen, I will be talking about heritage that's at risk, cultural sites that are at risk due to climate change. I'm going to start by giving you a little briefing on what archaeology is. Then we're going to go into a little bit of climate science and then how that's impacting cultural resources here in Florida. And by cultural resources, what I'm referring to mainly are archaeological and historic sites. So it could be things such as, you know, a Native American burial mound on the coast, or a cemetery, or a historic building. So I have a pretty broad definition of what you would consider a cultural resource. And here in Florida, not only are they important to us Floridians because they're parts of our past, our shared heritage, but in Florida, they're also really, really big contributors to our local tourist economy. People that come to Florida under usual circumstances, they come here to see not only Disney World and our beaches and things like that, but also sites like St. Augustine and downtown Sanford and Pensacola, these sites that have been here for a long time. In the case of St. Augustine, the longest time during European contact. And they contribute a lot to our economy, not just, you know, people spending money to see the sites, but the hotels, the restaurants, things like that. So this really will have an impact on Florida's economy, as well as the way that we live our lives. So first off, a little Archaeology 101. Archaeology is a science. It's a soft science or a social science, but we do use the scientific method. It's a destructive science, and by that I mean when you excavate a site, no matter how hard you try, you can't put it back together again the way it was prior to excavation. So that's why archaeologists are very meticulous when it comes to note-taking and documentation. And you'll see that if you attend Tristan's lecture when he talks about photogrammetry. That's one of the newer tools we have that's widely used to document sites. It's much more accurate than if we were to try and draw the sites like we had to in the past. Context is really important as well. I liken archaeology to crime scene investigation. We use a lot of the same methodology, but when you take something from an archaeological site, I always tell people to think about what would happen if you were to take a piece of evidence away from a crime scene. You would be destroying the capabilities of the detectives to be able to understand the whodunit, because they don't know where things are placed within the context of the crime scene anymore. Well, the same is true for archaeology. And what we're seeing is as we get these big storm events and things like that, that cause erosion and wash away sites, the context is being lost. We also have context being lost due to other factors like looting and things of that nature. So sites change both due to human causes and natural causes. It's not uncommon for an archaeological site that was documented, 20, 30 years ago, for us to go back today and that site either be drastically different or sometimes non-existent due to natural or human causes. And as a public archaeologist, I always have to mention public accessibility to information is really important to archaeologists. It's not our past, it's everybody's past. We're just the ones that are responsible for curating it. So I always tell people when I'm teaching them archaeology is not finished until there's a report written or a book written or something that tells people about the findings. All right, so when talking about sea level rise, I quite often hear people say, oh, sea level rise, that's not new. It's been happening for millennia. And they're absolutely correct. Archaeologists and geologists find evidence of this all the time. Geologists have tracked the ebb and flow of our coastline dating back several thousand years. In Florida, what you're looking at right now is what Florida looked like during the last interglacial period, which was about 10 to 12,000 years ago. Florida was a lot smaller. Much of our coastline that we see now was inundated, was underwater. And we actually find terrestrial sites from 12,000, 13,000 years ago that are now underwater. So it's quite interesting to do archaeology in Florida, because some terrestrial sites you actually have to access by doing maritime archaeology. So that's pretty unique. But we have seen this before. What's different now is the rate at which we're seeing the sea level rise and the reason sea level is rising. Does somebody have a question? Nope. Okay. So this is a very interesting graph that I found. Around 2012, NOAA was asked to do a review of sea level rise literature to kind of track the average that scientists suspected our sea levels would be rising. What they found is that there's a very high confidence that global mean sea level will rise at least 8 inches, but no more than 6.6 feet, about 2 meters. That's quite a wide range for scientists to deal with, and it makes it really hard for us to plan because we don't know exactly what's going to happen. And here in Florida, we're kind of familiar with that just from hurricane season. We don't know where it's going to go. We all stare at those noodles on the screen every day trying to figure out what we need to do to be prepared. Well, climate change is kind of the same thing, just you're looking at the long game. One thing that will affect us here in Florida is most scientists agree that the East Coast and the Gulf Coast are, the sea level is expected to rise the fastest. So here in Florida, obviously that's going to have a major impact on us. So this is a really interesting graph. Like I said, climate change has been happening for thousands and thousands of years, and there are both natural and man-made sources of carbon dioxide emissions. And if you look at this graph, at the top you see global temperature, then CO2 concentrations, and then sea level. And as you can see, there's a pretty close correlation between the three. Now, within the last 50 years or so, we've seen a spike in both CO2 concentrations, as well as, even though lesser so, global temperature and sea level. But there is scientific evidence that there is a correlation between the two, or three, excuse me. So this is really interesting. When we think of sea level rise, we all immediately probably go to that mental image of the polar bear on the ice that's melting, or ice falling into the ocean. And that is definitely a big cause for concern, and that is definitely contributing to sea level rise. About 33% of sea level rise is caused by ice melting. This is the equivalent to about 1,700 trillion pounds of ice melting from Antarctica, Greenland, and mountain glaciers per year. But then you also have other factors. Thermal expansion, of course, is a big one that accounts for about 20% as the water in the ocean gets warmer due to air temperature increases. The water molecules actually expand in size. So you have more water, the same amount of water, it's just taking up more space, but then also you have water that's being, dumped into the ocean by other factors that's also taking up space. Now, land shrinkage or sinkage, excuse me, is another factor that is cause for concern. About 20% of sea level rise is accounted for based on land sinkage. The Keys in the last 50 years has sunk about 1 inch, which doesn't seem like a lot, but if you have visited the Keys, it just doesn't take much. They're practically at sea level as it is. And then another factor I found extremely interesting, and something we don't really hear a lot about, is the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream takes warm, salty water from the south up towards the New England area. And as it cools down, it contracts, sinks because it becomes heavier. And this creates kind of a treadmill of water along the eastern coast. However, we have cool water from glaciers entering the ocean. And this is actually causing more fresh water to be added, more cooler water, and it's actually slowing down the Gulf Stream, which is causing kind of a heavy traffic situation along the Gulf Coast or along the eastern coast. So we're actually getting more water, making the sea levels on the eastern coast rise faster. So I thought that was absolutely fascinating when I learned that. And if you want to know more, obviously I'm not a climate scientist, but I would recommend going to NOAA's website. They have a lot of information on this. And you can see here I have animation. If you go to sealevelrise.org, there's a lot of good information there as well. But what this animation is showing is just how water expands as temperature increases and what that does. It causes sea levels to rise. So how on earth do we measure sea level? Well, one way we have today that we haven't always had is obviously satellite imagery. And NASA has been launching satellites. The most recent ones were launched in 2015. They launched 3 satellites to take measurements of our sea level on a daily basis. But we also, off the coast of Florida, have 8 buoys and 14 long-term tidal gauges. Buoys are pretty obvious here in Florida. We're pretty familiar with them. The buoys take measurements, and they've been out there for 20 years. So we have 20 years worth of data, and it allows us to get accurate measurements on a daily basis. I believe they take measurements every 6 minutes. So that's a lot of data to process. We also have tidal gauges, which are kind of like upside down measuring cups or upside down rain gauges, if you will. And there's 14 of them off the coast of Florida. And they also take measurements every 6 minutes. And then that information can be calculated and averaged out to show how over long-term sea levels are changing. So I'm an archaeologist. Why am I talking about all this climate change stuff? Well, cultural resources, although we don't necessarily hear a lot about them in regards to climate change, they are going to be impacted. Florida has always been a great place to live. People have for thousands of years flocked here for the climate, for the coastal resources. Not much has changed in that regard. And here in Florida, we have something called the Florida Master Site File, and it's a statewide database of all cultural resources that have been recorded in the state of Florida. And we have close to 400,000 cultural resources in the state that have been recorded. About 16,000 of them will be impacted by a 1 meter sea level rise. And of course, these are along the coast. This includes things like the entire historic district of Apalachicola, the St. Mark's Wildlife Refuge Lighthouse, the Keys, Key West, for example, the fort at St. Augustine. So these structures, these archaeological sites and cemeteries will all be impacted. The image to your left, or to your right, excuse me, is of historic cemeteries. Now, with a 2 meter sea level rise, remember that's the maximum of what the scientific literature is predicting, over 34,000 cultural resources will be impacted. So not only will people along the coast be impacted, but our economy, this is something else that will cause a rift in our economy, if you will. Now, people always want to talk about sea level rise as if it's only going to impact the coast. But as you may be aware, there are already people who are moving away from these areas because of bigger storm events, flooding. In South Florida, they have flooding that occurs, even on sunny days. So we have cultural resources on the interior that will be impacted. Think about people moving into the interior. Think about how that will impact, our infrastructure needs, our density, urban density. What will happen to places like Old City Cemetery and, Lake Jackson Mounds. as people try to move inland. We need to account for those so that they remain protected as much as possible. So while this map shows cultural resources on the coast, we have to keep in the back of our mind that sites inland will also see an impact. Now, if you are interested, NOAA has a really awesome resource on their website. It's called the Sea Level Rise Viewer. And this is a couple screen captures I took of the Sea Level Rise Viewer for St. Mark's Wildlife Refuge's lighthouse, historic lighthouse there. It's a National Register property, very significant to our area's history. And what's really neat about the Sea Level Rise Viewer is you can toggle up and down on the left-hand side of the screen to see what certain places will look like as the sea level rises. You can even zoom out and get an overview of certain areas. Here in Tallahassee, when you look at the Sea Level Rise Viewer, looks like we'll hopefully be okay, but obviously people to our south won't necessarily be. And this shows what would happen with both a 3-foot level increase, which is a little flooding, and then a 6-foot level increase, which is about the maximum of what they're predicting again. And as you can see, the lighthouse would probably be gone. Although it's standing here in this image, the water intrusion and things like that would make it so that the lighthouse would not survive. A historic structure cannot withstand being inundated with water for long periods of time. So archaeologists for the last couple of years around the state and around the country, and in fact around the world, have recognized this as an issue. We've kind of taken NASA's approach to climate change and adapted it for our use. It's a two-pronged approach, looking at both mitigation and adaptation. We know we're not going to be able to save all the coastal archaeological sites. It's just not feasible, both financially as well as just, well, by any means is it really feasible. So what we've been doing is monitoring sites to first understand how they're being impacted. If we don't know how they're being impacted, it makes it almost impossible to understand how to save what we can and mitigate what we can't. We have sites, like I said, that haven't been seen in 30 years. So we don't know what impact hurricanes, erosion, things like that have had on them. So we're making more of an effort to monitor these sites and get out there and get baseline data for them. And then we're also looking for adaptive strategies that will help either slow the decline of these sites or stop or save them completely. So things like seagrasses and oyster beds and riprap to help with erosion control have been very, so far, very productive in stabilizing sites and protecting them. But we don't know exactly how they'll work in the long run. But the only way you can find out is by trying and experimenting. But it is something that archaeologists are aware of and have been working to adapt to. Now, in addition to just general sea level rise, another thing we have to consider here in Florida is warmer waters cause bigger storms. And we've seen that in the last few years. And Hurricane Matthew was no exception to that, as you all know. And we were really lucky, and this was kind of our aha moment. One of my colleagues went out to this well. You can see in the top photo, a well that, was in the ground, like a well should be. And this is a well in St. Augustine on the East Coast. And she took a photo of it. And then after Hurricane Matthew, she went out and took another photo of it. It's the same exact site. It's the same exact feature, the well. And it looks like it's completely built above ground now because of the amount of erosion. And that is one storm event. And we don't have that kind of data for most of the archaeological sites in Florida, where we know what impact one event will have to a cultural resource. So this was a really interesting moment for us where we realized, wow, if one hurricane can do that to a site, and some sites haven't been visited for 20 years, what's happening to those sites, and how will we know how to help them, how to mitigate them, and what's being lost? So we created a program called Heritage Monitoring Scouts, and this is based off of a program that they actually have in Scotland. Now there they have different land use laws, different property laws, things like that, but we adapted it as best we could to Florida. And the whole idea is to get the public signed up, trained up, and out there, because there's more people going out than there are archaeologists in the state. And as they're out hiking or doing their usual activities, we have kayak groups that go out, turtle rescue groups, people that like to hike, families that will go out, and they'll gather data. And all it is a couple photographs and a quick form you fill out on our website. And that gives us the information, that baseline data that will help us better understand how these sites are changing due to storm events, due to erosion, if there's any looting, things like that. And it's been really, really helpful to us and really interesting to see how some of these sites have been impacted. At Lake Jackson Mounds, there's a mill site there, Butler Mill. If you go hiking kind of south of the parking lot, when you get into the state park and you go on those hiking trails, you'll walk right past it. And it's been impacted by erosion just due to the fact that it's kind of downhill, and there's that Winn-Dixie parking lot and some other development to the southwest of it. And it's been interesting for me as a local here in Tallahassee to go out to that site after big storm events and see how it's been impacted. So that's been kind of my baby. And there's other sites in Florida and in the Tallahassee area that are impacted as well. So while this is something that a lot of people on the coast do, this is something that's important for inland archaeology sites as well. But it was launched in 2016, and we have close to 400 scouts, I believe, now statewide, and over 1,000 sites monitored. Now, as you'll recall from that map that I showed you earlier, there's 16,000 or over 16,000 archaeological sites that will be impacted by cultural or by a 1 meter sea level rise. And so we want data on all of those if possible. We're being very ambitious with this. I mean, anything we can get is great, but if we could get it all, that would be wonderful. And this is something I know right now we're all socially distancing, hopefully, but this is something that you can do with your family in remote areas. And if you're interested in it, my email's right here, barbara.a.clark@uwf.edu. And I wanted to also mention before I take any last questions that I hope you all are really, please stay safe. If you're looking for things to do or you have young children in your household and you need to keep them busy for a little while, we do have lesson plans available on our website, videos, virtual tours. If you follow us on Facebook, we have 8 offices throughout the state. All of our offices are really doing our public outreach on social media. So we have tours, and we're sharing tours from other organizations as well. And we're also happy to do virtual lectures and workshops to the best of our ability. And we also, if you just have a little kid or an adult that is interested in archaeology and just wants to talk to an archaeologist, we're here for you. Please email me and I can set you up with somebody to talk to. But with that being said, I don't see any questions in the chat, but let me quit sharing my screen so I can see everybody's faces. Hello. Does anybody have any questions? No questions? Okay. Well, I really appreciate you all taking the time to, I would say, come out, but sit in front of your computers today.
Hello? Is it working? Okay, I'm still learning computers.
Sure, no problem.
My question is, so what is the anticipated time frame if we don't change our way, so to speak, that this 1-inch level of sea rising might occur?
So I've heard anywhere, and again, this is what is somewhat frustrating about climate change issues. I've heard anywhere from 20 years to 50 years. So probably somewhere in between there. Again, I'm not a climate scientist, so I'm just going off of the research that I've done from NOAA, NASA, and other, scientific, hopefully reliable resources. But we are already starting to see the sea level rise, and we'll probably continue to do so. I've also heard some folks argue that it's too late, that it's, we've waited too long to mitigate it. I don't know how true that is. I'm a forever optimist, so I hope that's not true. But does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. And what are the things that they're looking at mitigating it? I mean, I know, like you said, we're watching it and trying to keep an observation on it, but what are the things they're trying to do to mitigate it?
Well, I'm looking specifically at archaeological sites and what we're doing to kind of keep them around as long as we can, essentially. And we've been doing things, monitoring mainly, documenting what we have, because like I said, if we don't have that baseline data, then we really don't know what impact sea level rise is having. But other things we've been doing are experimenting with different coastal and seagrasses to help ward off erosion. They kind of create a buffer. I know there's also been experiments with other plants, mangroves I'm thinking of, and also oyster shell has been shown to be a pretty good buffer when it comes to erosion. It helps buffer the wave action, which can cause sites to erode. Does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. I volunteer at St. Mark's.
Oh.
I'm a person who talks about the lighthouse keepers' quarters. I give tours at the lighthouse keepers' quarters. And I really noticed what happened with Michael. You know, our park was closed for several weeks, like everybody else. And when I came back, I could already tell the difference when I walked on the side, on the sea, the sandy area on the side of the lighthouse. I could already see how it came in. And I was just amazed. I'm just like, this used to be so much wider.
Yeah.
It's not wide anymore. I could remember being at St. Mark's 20 years ago, and there was a lot more area to walk in.
Yeah.
It's the lighthouse, and it is really, really shrunk. But what I did notice recently that I guess I didn't pay attention to before was the amount of crabs. We just have a lot of crabs. So I'm thinking maybe they purposely are putting the crabs there because I can't believe how many crabs there were.
Oh, I have
tons and tons and tons of crabs. Like they were walking in the pavement in front of the lighthouse to the point that people accidentally stepped on them because there was so many of them. They were kind of like going from the sea to I don't know where, crossing the grass. And I'm just like, wow, never seen so many crabs in my life.
Well, that might correlate to the storm event or the sea level rise. It would be interesting to know that. I do know that prior to the pandemic, we were looking at doing some monitoring as well as a workshop out at St. Mark's. Right now, obviously not a good time for that. But once things do start getting back to normal, we do plan on putting in a permit so that we will be able to do some site monitoring out there and hopefully work with you all at the Wildlife Refuge to do a couple monitoring workshops so that your volunteers will be able to help us with monitoring sites out there, because there's a lot of them out there.
Yes, ma'am. I love St. Mark's. I live in Tallahassee too, and I love St. Mark's. I miss it. I miss being able to be in my lighthouse.
Yeah, I know. It's hard for all of us. We're all outdoorsy people and we're all kind of stuck going to our yards. I don't know about you all, but I've been doing a lot of gardening lately. Does anybody else have any questions?
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. And I appreciate you all joining us, and please stay safe.
Yeah, thank you for coming. And come next week to the cemetery one. It'll be really good. All right. Barbara, you'll have to end the meeting.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.